David Bowie's Memory of a Free Festival captures the sense of nostalgia common in rock music of the early 1970s. You can hear a sense of loss in David Bowie's remembrance of a music festival in England in 1969. The dream of the late 60s appeared to be dead. It was unsustainable. Many hippies were experiencing the downside of drug use in the form of addiction and even the death of friends and loved ones. This loss of the 60s hippie dream manifested itself in several different ways in the early 1970s. We will explore two different reactions to the end of the 60s in this presentation: singer-songwriters and the height of the album as a work of art. The clearest example of the cultural changes happening after the 60s is the singer-songwriter era. Folk music was still popular in the early 70s, but a shift in lyrical content and mood can be detected. Instead of singing about political change in exuberant tones, 1970s folk singer-songwriters became more personal, and their recordings offered warm, comforting tones for the listener. One of the most creative songwriters of the era was Canadian folk singer Joni Mitchell. Mitchell wrote the iconic tune Woodstock while watching footage of the event on television in a hotel room. Her distance from the actual festival gives the song a contemplative and romantic character. As you listen, notice the natural imagery and mystical language common in singer-songwriter lyrics of this time period. The lyrics refer to the biblical Garden of Eden, the origin point of humanity. She also references origins in the chorus as she sings about the beginnings of the evolution of humans from stardust, billion-year-old carbon. This mix of the scientific origin narrative and the Genesis account is the backdrop for a nostalgia concerning the hippie dream of the 60s. The Woodstock Festival, Joni Mitchell suggests, was an attempt to reclaim a lost innocence found at the beginning of time. The song takes on a sad, reflective quality when considering that many of the goals of Woodstock for radical societal change and reclaimed innocence were not ultimately achieved. James Taylor is one of the singer-songwriter icons of the early 70s. Fire and Rain also draws on natural, mystical imagery to symbolize the turmoil Taylor experienced. The first verse refers to a friend of his who committed suicide. Verse 2 speaks to Taylor's experience in mental institutions as a young man undergoing shock therapy. Verse 3 references the Flying Machines, Taylor's one-time band that had recently broke up. Taylor acknowledges that he's seen his share of trouble, but this is not a blues song. Fire and Rain offers a musical sense of comfort despite the many trials the lyrics refer to, perhaps a little bit more like the Tin Pan Alley style. One of the best songwriters of the era, Carole King, had written many hits in the 1960s, but rose to popularity after her solo album, Tapestry. The album cover perfectly exemplifies the aesthetic of the 1970s folk singer-songwriters. Carole King is in her home, relaxed and comfortable with her cat. The lyrics, once again, are centered around natural imagery of seasons and storms. Personal relationships are clearly important to King in this song, which is a different approach from the grandiose visions of folk music of the 1960s. Carole King's album was highly popular, not just as a radio phenomenon, but mostly as a record. In the late 60s and early 70s, the long-playing album, the LP, was really coming into its own. The success of album sales allowed many artists to feel free from the confines of radio singles. They became more creative and followed the idea of developing a record listening experience that felt more like a journey from beginning to end. This led to the concept album, which was instigated by the competition between Brian Wilson and the Beatles. A concept album is a set of songs held together by one or more themes. The Beatles' response to Brian Wilson's Pet Sounds was Sgt. Pepper's Lonely Hearts Club Band. The Beatles had become fed up with touring since their fans had become so loud that the band couldn't even hear their instruments while playing live. So they retreated to the studio to create an album that developed almost like a novel. The cover of Sgt. Pepper's shows the kind of self-reflection about pop stardom the Beatles were engaging in at the time. Here, the Beatles dress up as Sgt. Pepper's Lonely Hearts Club Band and are pictured with a wide range of famous and influential figures, including an early photograph of the Beatles themselves. Other important concept albums of the time included The Who's Tommy, a rock opera that tells the story of a deaf, dumb, and blind boy growing up after World War II in England who has one great skill. He is a very good pinball player. If this seems like a strange premise for a rock opera, think of it as a retelling of Chuck Berry's Johnny Be Good. The idea of a young man, ill-equipped for normal society, who's able to overcome this by being amazing at something seemingly inconsequential. This is the very story of rock and roll fame. David Bowie's Ziggy Stardust is another concept album telling the story of a bisexual alien rock star who's trying to communicate peace and love to his audience. Tragically, Ziggy is defeated by his own excesses and his own fame. And Pink Floyd's Dark Side of the Moon explores mental illness, greed, and conflict in a tightly conceived sonic landscape. The album was recorded using some of the most sophisticated electronic techniques at the time and took the sonic quality of rock music to new heights. These concept albums are highly important in the history of popular music, but they were produced in England. They are part of a progressive rock movement in the early stages of development in the UK that would have a huge influence on American music as well. Progressive rock musicians took the idea that rock and pop music could be as complex and thematically rich as the highest works of art. The Rolling Stones also drew on inspiration from the art world, but they stuck to the simplicity of sex and rock and roll found in the blues and rhythm and blues. Here is the iconic album cover of the Stones' Sticky Fingers album, designed by pop artist Andy Warhol. The cover shows a close-up of a man's crotch in jeans. You can't tell from the picture, but if you owned the record, you could actually unzip the pants on the cover. Inside, you can see what's under the jeans, a figure wearing an Andy Warhol brand of underwear. And on the back of the album is the backside of that figure in jeans. Here are the band promoting the album in various forms of dress and undress. Though LP records have made a comeback in sales recently, partly because of the diminishing sound quality of digital music, album artwork is not valued as it once was. Though interesting album artwork seems on its way to becoming obsolete, perhaps the visual art form's relationship with music has been substituted for other media, like, for instance, the music video, which we'll explore later.